This is GTR, Genesis Timeline and Roots. In a world of fractured stories, timelines buried, and truths erased, one project dares to ask the question, what if everything you thought you knew about history was wrong? This is GTR, Genesis Timeline and Roots. A 5,025-year simulated walkthrough tracing a melanated Adam back to 4000 BC. Over the last decade, new revelations confirm a black origin for humanity, from European vaults to tribal memory, Babylon to Britain. This is not just history, this is a challenge, a simulation, a movement. Meet the man behind GTR, Dr. Wilton MacDonald II, Caymanian, British, Jamaican, haplogroup E and stateless for 26 years. Now a global explorer, 119 countries and counting. A hedge fund lawyer, a UK chartered accountant, a seeker of the lost archives of our people. But the question remains, if all black people came out of Africa, does that make us only African? Or are we also European, Scottish, Native American, Jacobite Hebrew, Asian? GTR exists to answer that question. You've felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. A splinter in your mind. That splinter has brought you here, to GTR. Whites can't trace their roots before the 1800s. Where's ours? Where are the tribes? The languages, the kings, the queens, the true Hebrews? Where did the giants go? Where are the Neanderthals? Angels, aliens. Why do we speak in so many tongues? Was Babel just a myth? A memory? History has holes. Hollywood has lied. The system was never made for us to remember. Only 5 to 8% of people today are white. And what about the 1800 stories and postcards of the cabbage babies? But nearly all history books center their story. That doesn't add up. Atlantis, lost cities, vanished civilizations, or were they erased? Try GTR. Take the red pill and awaken to the truth of your ancestors. Or take the blue pill and keep dreaming a fantasy. GTR, a simulated walkthrough of Black Hebrew history and eschatology. This is the beginning of remembering.
In this episode, we have covered so far a few gaps, as I say in the literature. This is still my first month at the Cambridge, one of the grad schools, doing a creative writing course. And this, all of this information collected from GTR is helping me to professionally write, customize, streamline the life story and my life story on the McDonald's. So there's been revealed a few gaps in the research, which is critical for any graduate course program. critical for the next degree in which all of this work will be amalgamated and sandwiched into another higher doctorate that I'm doing. And it's all relevant. I pointed out the gaps in the DNA, or call it orphan files, where I am matching someone on their sites, DNA sites, and neither parent is a DNA match. Well over 800 such cases, but there are about 300 that I detailed in the last week's episode. I also went on to talk about the electric slide, electric shuffle, how the tracing on white ancestors and white ancestry. Again, not picking on whites. After all, I'm part white myself, and my wife, of course, is white and from Poland. Well, from Poland in the last 100 years. So it is when tracing those roots of white ancestors that the tree meanders and shuffles like the electric slide, go to the left, go to the right, and hardly ever you find a tree. In all of my searches, all of my tracing, I have looked at thousands of trees, and they all seem, even the ones for royals and nobles, there are many lines, several lines and family names that are retired, that terminate. In the case of Madingley Hall in Cambridge, Sir John Hind, his line terminates quickly after about not even 2 generations, and then slips to another surname, Cotton, and goes down to King, and then winds up being Elliot surname. So you don't find that direct ancestral path, which would make your searches so much easier in the last, say, 200, 300 years. And so that's the difficulty and the challenges that I faced, and I've seen that those trees, and a lot of cases where there are no kids, meaning no issue, or you have no male ancestors, which you have a drop, the surname just is wiped out, and the daughter of this couple of union then will move on to have another surname, and the child would, there'd be a different paternal link. It's always heavy on the X chromosome. The Y is under attack, and I see that there is something looming here. It's not just one thing or 2 things. I mean, I'm pointing out gaps. We have the case where, of course, you have the orphan files on an autosomal level. Just not seeing the matches with my parents, and we have no known genetic problems. We've heavily tested. We go to the doctor for the least smallest thing and get checked out, and we've done battery of tests, all of us. So it's not like a question of, this is this disease, and we can understand that there may be a breakdown and lack of reading on one chromosome because you have this disorder, and you have lab conditions that that may influence a test. Even the algorithms that the labs will use, the ethnicity profiles, and their data sets will be different. So that will influence different results. But the orphan files and not matching at a fairly high level, and no parent is matching. My parents are not related to each other at all. They're not. So it begs the question, and it's room for further research. So there's that issue with the orphan files. There's an issue with the white ancestral tracing and going from one side of the tree to the next. And there are just several other issues that I've kind of pointed to. Clearly, the numbers, looking at the demographic data, certainly doesn't make much sense when you look at the amount of whites today that are living, and do a country by country analysis. How do you go back in time And maybe that would explain why those trees terminate at different levels in forcing one to look at other families rather than continuation, because the multiplier effect. I mean, you do have you have two parents, you have four grandparents, and then you have 8 great grandparents, and it multiplies and multiplies. So the distribution of relatives, it's exponential. I mean, it grows and grows and grows, and so if you have a termination of a line, then there's no more members to be added. You have to go elsewhere. And so it keeps those numbers in sort of conservative and cult, because naturally you have to be conservative when you're talking about not even 700 million whites, non-Hispanic whites out of the 8.2 billion people on the planet. And again, you notice things in doing tests. The other thing that I've noticed that I have not discussed before in GTR would be in the independent labs. You notice that the haplogroup E, I could almost tell when someone's a haplogroup E, because these saliva tests that they give and they distribute for collection of the samples, they have a buffer, a preserver that will help to preserve that sample until it's processed by the lab. And under the same conditions of taking the test, making sure that persons don't eat or drink 4 hours for the test, and making sure that you follow all the instructions and they don't smoke, and everything that would mitigate against having a proper valid sample. Make sure that all the precautions are taken. But you're adding, at the end of the day, when the saliva is collected, you're adding that buffer. In this case, it's some orangey liquid. And I'm saying to myself, I've noticed a pattern emerging. And it's always the case that you have the haplogroup E's, my haplo, that those persons, I can almost tell when someone's an E, because when they run the first batch in the lab and they're trying to get to that next level where they can determine if it's a viable sample or not, they need about 20 micrograms of material. And in order to reach that point of 20 micrograms to run the sample, and it takes 3 months to run. So a whole lot of analysis, which again, I wouldn't even dare get into. But those haplogroup E's almost always, in every case, will have to be concentrated. The samples taken are degraded. Now, a couple of things. Does that mean that Black people somehow would have more bacteria in the mouth than other races? I mean, what it is. I think it's the preserver. It's the preserver, because everything else is consistent, everything else is the same, but I can always tell those samples that need a little bit of help, that need to be amplified, as they say in the scientific context, in order to come up with enough material of the 20 micrograms to run that sample. And I smiled to myself and I said, I know it's going to be. I know it's going to be. And after 3 months, those samples, those Black Hebrews, those haplogroup E brothers, and I see it pretty much over 90%, that those that are weak and have to be concentrated. And one thing about Blacks is you can't use the word weak in any context. I mean, really, but the sample, I mean, it's nonsensical to think that, oh, well, Blacks will have a higher proportion of bacteria so that, the sample is degraded when it reaches the lab, because they proportion enough buffer in order to preserve that sample. And most times these people brush their teeth and they take the test in the morning when they get up, but don't gargle or use Listerine, because again, that will interfere with the test, but they would do that. But there you have it. I mean, it's possibly the buffer which acts against in some way. We know that certain foods don't agree with blacks. I mean, I could cite one, whole milk for sure. I take whole milk and wiped out for the day. But certain things don't agree. So those who make the buffers, they should know. And are they encouraging us to do the test? Are they discouraging us? Of course, there is a certain narrative. And that's what GTR. Yes, GTR is about helping people connect. Again, this past week, someone else, Forbes, reached out to me, and there are many family members that they want to connect with other members of the family. They see the extensive tree. They see my tree being over 1.1 million in size. It is one of the largest private trees around, and I have given access to hundreds, if not thousands of people to connect freely to the tree. And it's available in open access, open source. So they want to connect and they want to help me to connect. And that is one of the goals of GTR. My other goals is to really, and first and foremost, to set out a map, a framework. Like I said, if you're going to compose anything from a song to an essay, whatever you're going to do, you need a structure, you need format, you need a framework. And this framework, it's the historical framework that we're trying to hammer out. What's the timeline from, they say creation, because we believe in the creation model. What's the time frame? And what are the main mile markers along the journey from Adam, from BC 4000 coming through? That's a roughly 5,026 years if you account for that dark age period. 582 became 1582. And so the aims of GTR is to hammer out and agree a proper time frame and timeline which we can put the historical pieces into place, when we can reconcile those things that's just seeming so incredulous and way off the base. We notice there are several mysteries. We know of the case where we could cite several. The people at Stonehenge just, picked up and their mysteries as to who created it. Did they use cranes? How did they put those stones in place? The Machu Picchu, the people in Peru just up and left in the Neolithic sites in Orkney, Scotland, that I physically visited. Mystery, the people just left. And so many sites and places that cannot be explained and rationalized and put into context. They just simply don't know. The Bayeux Tapestry, showing all whites that are British and Norman French in the 11th century. Well, that's, how come they are all white in appearance? And the population then would have been 300 million. How can you account for that level of, whites in the population compared to what it is today? What happened? Oh, this plague and this event happened, but not convinced that this would have, result in so few a number. And I'm going to stretch into another episode and reach into, I call it, episode 2027, when we're going to look at some of the old Hebrew roots, some of the even families, some of the family trees, and what even God and his promises, when he said about the numbers of the seeds of Abraham, of Jacob, being likened to the stars of heaven and the sands of the sea. How can you put that in proper context? How can you say, did God was simply lying? Was he making it up? He did not fulfill his promise as to the generations of man and the seeds of Abraham, seeds of Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. We need to come full circle to who we are, what we are, where we are. Ask those philosophical, deep questions in an effort to try. And that's another aim, GTR, to place us in the proper historical context, but then subject to a proper timeline. So we have covered some grounds, we covered some gaps. Then we have the founders of the elite schools, the three best schools we count. We have some missing pieces in the genealogy of Oxford, Harvard, Cambridge. I've shown that. We have some doubts raised as to the true owners, even back to Mandingley Hall in Cambridge, Sir John Hind. And I didn't say this before, but Hind was again a surname on my dad's side. His grandmother, his paternal grandmother, Lydia Hind, and Hind, Hind, and not Hynd. So that name stands out as something in my past. And connecting up now the stories of the Caribbean and how it relates to Europe, to Scotland, to England, and these places that were clearly Black melanated places. And from Black, then we could see how we got a lot of fair-skinned people around the planet, the Hispanics, and you trace their roots, and a lot of them just don't have. Those who live in Puerto Rico, those who live in Brazil, those who live in Central America countries. I mean, a lot of people have not done the deep dives beyond the 1800s. And it's like disingenuous for some people who are following the family, tree searches and join these sites, and then they can go back in time. And then those trees don't add up and match up because they're going way into the 17 and 1600s. But yet they can't account for those numbers of the family members. If you would take their information and put it in a model of parents and grandparents and great grandparents and see how many persons would arise from those numbers, and try to match it up to what they have now. I have been on a lot of fora, and I could see that family members are trying to reach out to their families. They live in the States. Like I said it before, more than 80% of all white Americans can trace their roots to Ellis Island, and that place was just like a drop-off point, and people not fleeing any persecution, people who just showed up from an orphanage or some other unknown place. That's just it. So Cabbage Baby linked. They came to Ellis Island, and then they made life. And this is the next part of the episode of 25B and 26 that we're going to cover. We're going to do a deep dive based on racism by country. Not all the countries, but if you think about the most racist countries, and I'm not trying to single out any, but it's just following the breadcrumbs. Hansel and Gretel, following the breadcrumbs. The US has had a really, really bad record. I mean, we don't even know how much property damage was done. People are still waiting for their 40 acres and a mule. Blacks have been disadvantaged, have been called every derogatory name, have been subject to all kinds of physical harm, danger, lynchings, imprisonment. I mean, being imprisoned is a form of sterilization. I mean, these guys are locked up for the rest of their lives, and that, culls the population. And the Black women have had a huge risks in delivering children. The mortality rate, either the baby or the mom or both. You could look at the medical studies. You can look into the journal, something that I did look at, and the elements of foods and things that do work against Blacks. But you have America's One Case, and they had laws which you would go to jail if you had interracial coupling in the 1930s or 40s, and before the Civil Rights Acts were passed. I mean, you literally can go to jail And they had the sundown laws, Jim Crow, so many policies that really worked against. And there's a big problem. The biggest problem of all would be the classification of Black people in America. Who are they? Let's talk and tell the truth. There are records now coming out of the Red Indians, and they're not a lot of them left, but my mom is an Indian. I know what an Indian person, is, and I have my Pacific Island brothers and sisters who a lot of them share African roots, with haplogroups E and C and D. So they're my brothers. But the Indians that you find in the North America, killed out and culled because of cowboy and Indian stories, there would have had to be cowboys for those stories to make sense. And if you look at the small number of whites and taking it back and again regressing it, we just don't lack that vision, that ability, that cognitive raw ability to look at it. How can you police people in Africa to ensure that they spoke French, especially French, and they spoke Portuguese or they spoke English? How many missionaries came there? How many cowboys went to America and killed off those Indians and fought those battles? How many? Can you just do the numbers? Again, it really, really doesn't add up. And so those Indians, there are stories and records again. The viewer can make up your minds that they were transported from places like Mongolia and in Asia and taken to America somewhere around the 1860s or so. And 2 training colleges taught how to become Indian. But the Black people are really the natives. I mean, why will you take literally sand to the beach? Who does that? From the Caribbean island, who does that? You don't need abundance of Black people to work and enslave and to abuse. Why do you need to take tens of millions from Africa? Why is Calabar, Nigeria, the capital of Nigeria, when that was the biggest port for slave trading? Why will you do dirt at home? Why was it really made the capital of Nigeria? It should have been someplace else, maybe Abuja, maybe someplace else, but not Calabar, because you don't want to, because of risks, obviously. I mean, being a lawyer, I'm not into vice and crime, but you're not going to do dirt in your backyard. You're not going to do dirt at home. And it made sense that ports like Calabar were welcoming ports for the fleeing Black Europeans to come into Africa, moving into Africa. And into Africa, they brought with them their languages, be it English or French. They brought with them their cultural sort of norms. And you can see a lot of interplay between Europe too and Africa to this day. And religion, where a lot of us, surprisingly, a lot of us were Hebrew, and we have deep Jewish roots. Again, they're scholars and people who have studied this. Kenyan journalists who researched, and the good Reverend Joshua Mapunga, who even is from Africa, from Zimbabwe, who analyzed most of Africa and just said, look, we have more Judaism here than anything else, beyond the white Christianity. Of course, Jesus was never white, beyond Islam. And a lot of Africans today subscribe to Islam. Again, I'm not judging, that's the preference and choice, but what choice was it? When that movie Roots, what is so damning and distortive, that whole film will contain scenes and narration from some white slavers, their judgment of Blacks being, they're inferior and they are animals and they're cannibals. There are clips that I even shared publicly about that film, but it's in form of indoctrination. Mostly, a lot of the directors were Jews. I call them modern day Jews. Don't refer to. I rather hold on to the Hebrew label. So we're Hebrews, like the sands of the sea. We were all mostly Hebrews, either practicing or non-practicing. Islam appears to be new, like 200 years and change. Muhammad would not have been in 600 because 600 was 1600. But in that movie, when Kunta Kinte was born, his father placed him up and just say, Allah be praised, okay? I mean, come on, 1970s. What happened to Jehovah? Or to say God be praised, something neutral, but specifically. And in that movie, they refer to the blacks as Muslim devils and worshiping false god, Allah, and they were just making sport of it. So how old is that religion? It's been heaved on Africans who have lost their way in terms of their religious roots, and they subscribe to a religion that was practiced by pretty much blacks, because that was the planet, whether it be in Europe or Africa, black people following, worshiping, Jehovah, the Hebrew, God, Elohim, from the Bible. And it's not just Ethiopia. So I'm convinced with the study, with the work done in GTR, that we're on to something. And so for this episode, this part 2 of 25, we will take a look at those countries which had the worst records of not just discrimination, but brutal treatment of blacks. I mean, brutal, violent treatment and discrimination. The US would take the top spot. South Africa would be next from post-1945 and their apartheid. And of course, Australia, where there are reports that they were playing literally hockey with they bury the bodies of, they would just bury natives up to their heads. And then they'd be playing hockey with not trying to knock off heads. I can't even begin to go there. And I've traveled to Australia a few times, and I see how, the blacks they're considered holy and unapproachable. But when I would go and talk, people, their antennas perk up. And I'm trying to do the DNA swab, and then you have people lining up, whites looking and say, okay, so what are you doing? What are you doing? Be inquisitive. I said, this is not your business, please. And the only time that I had a bag go missing from inside the plane was leaving Australia, the northern part of Australia, with DNA samples. Fortunately, it was in a different bag. But the only time I've lost a bag, not checked luggage, we're talking about in-cabin bags, was on that trip. So you could say that it was just a fluke or something connected with my work. But we're still moving ahead and exploring with these countries which had the worst records. And those countries, what would then be the correlation between the numbers of those cabbage babies and migrants that arrived on shore, that just showed up in America? That was the country with the largest, influx of whites. And then you had scattered in Europe, because Europe just assumed that it was Europe is white. A lot of Americans, they derive their existence and identity from a white Europe and worshiping a white Christ. So those icons, those labels, and we have been given many labels to subscribe to. But this is our task, to unpack and to peel back some of these things to reveal the essence of what is their truth or error. So with that, I will go into those countries which again had the worst records of discrimination and brutal treatment of Blacks. And those were also countries with a very, very high proliferation and rate of migration of these, call it cabbage babies, that were sent to, South Africa, were sent to Australia, sent to the USA. So you could draw the conclusions yourself, and I will then speak more about it.
This is GTR, Genesis Timeline and Roots.
So we know that there are celebrated cases of racism, and we look at the worst records of history. According to the racism by country, it is widely condemned, and 182 states are parties now to an international convention on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, 14th of May, 2026. Oh, goodness. 14th of May, 2026. Well, boy, better late than never. So we have these countries, but we know the worst ones. You have to think about it. You don't even need a Wikipedia encyclopedia. The countries with the worst records when it comes to racism, placism, racial discrimination would be, think of Nazi Germany, right? You could think, but that was against, the kind of jury is out. GTR is trying to figure out how much of it, was really, really true and boils down to facts, and facts supported by records. But we know the USA has a ghastly record of murdering, discriminating against Blacks over the last 100 years. We have South Africa with the apartheid from the 1940s. America got started way before that, probably 1910s, 1920s. 1900s. We know the Adventist co-founder Ellen White, she was sent off packing in Australia just about the turn of the century. We had a history in USA, South Africa, they even put it Australia. And then add to the list Argentina as one of the whitest South American countries. And speaking to Guy Anderson, who featured on GTR, when you look at the proliferation of the cabbage babies, 80% of all whites in America can trace roots to Ellis Island without any kind of religious persecution, without any kind of rhyme or reason and rationale. You had a lot of people come into the States to Ellis Island in the latter part of the 1800s to the early 1900s. And this is documented. They were given names. It's not even their names. Blacks, we have our names. I'm a McDonald. That's been proven. I have so much information to support that with no slave history, and 200 more melanated haplogroup E brothers, cousins who share my story. So we came across the pond as prisoners from Europe, from Scotland. The whites, 80% at least, or more, trace the roots to Ellis Island, coming off the boat. And they came from orphanages. But where did they come from before that? With the massive amount of children, which again, Guy Anderson talks about. We talk about a massive amount of whites that came into the States only in the last 150 years to South Africa. It was not during any Black Dutch, Boerish conquests and wars and colonization. Literally within the last 150 years, cabbage babies described came in cages. They were taken in cages, sent packing to places like South Africa, like New Zealand, like Australia, like Argentina, where they had rules. It's like Cuba. You had laws that would encourage social mobility. You'd be more socially mobile if you were whites. They actually had laws in these Spanish-speaking countries that would encourage whites to move there and give more rights and privileges to whites. So we had all of that going on literally in the last 150 plus years. So what is the correlation? The correlation that those countries which had the worst records and discrimination and practices against blacks, and even though there was evidence here that Jews were expelled, then back to my friend Joshua Mapunga, Africa is more Jewish in a lot of ways, roots-wise, than even the state of Israel. So when it talks about Jews being expelled, we can go through it. And let's go through this country by country. In Algeria, we have majority would be ethnically Arab, but we all do know and visited, in Algeria too. Their population was lightened in the last 200 years. And it talks about the Berbers, the same Berbers. Today, they're 15 to 24%, but they were the majority of the population just 200 years ago. It talks about the small percentage of Algerians that are French and Spanish, Italian heritage. Now, there was a home of a significant Jewish population. Now, that's the thing. Are we talking about Black Jews or some other color? When it talks about expulsion of Jews, make note that we're talking about Black people. There's no huge history when it comes to racial discrimination. Botswana, what's the record? No major record. This is talking about people migrating. Whites tend to have come through South Africa, but we don't have a large population of whites that are living in Botswana. Burundi. Well, here we're talking about the ethnic pygmies and the pygmy population discriminated against. Namibia, genocidal acts against the ethnic people. And in the Niger, we had between the Arab population living there, and they had a practice of slavery, pygmies affected in the Congo, and Bantu. Rwanda as well mentioned, and we all know of the recent, killings in Rwanda and the genocide in 94. Somalia, South Africa. Well, South Africa is one of the largest places that have discriminated clearly against Black people. But here it is that we have prejudice and racism, which is between Arabs and Blacks. Again, Arabs. What time frame are we looking at? Here, you're talking about racism in the Arab world targeted at Black Arabs. Clearly, the Berbers have been prejudiced. Okay, clearly there's a section here dealing with anti-Semitism. But again, are we talking about original Hebrews, original Jews expelled from Africa? And how do you define a truly Semitic person? So in this episode, it's a bit of an eclectic mix. First, we got started on the ethnicities. You could see here my DNA chart makes me triracial. I'm essentially three races in one, Black, white, and everything in between. So this is true, 40% essentially Black, but that's Hebrews, Scottish, African, all rolled in one beautiful package. 10% roughly, call it Caucasian, and about 50% and half East Indian, taken from my mom. But this is it. I encourage everyone, we all should take the plunge and do a DNA test. It doesn't matter. I mean, now I'm testing in private labs here in Europe, but you can do a commercial test. And you don't know what you'll find. And you may, because autosomal results are only tracking 5 generations, if you wait too long, you might miss a generation. You may just miss that important link to the past because it's a rolling timeline. As common sense dictates, it's 5 generations. And so, these companies are recalibrating every month, every year. So you may just miss out on that opportunity if you delay, and that 25-year generational gap, bites you and you lose the connectivity. So this is how I am made up. This is what you're seeing, and it's a diverse, rich picture, because that 40% said has been the most fascinating of all, as far as unpacking the Hebrew, the Jacobite, the Scottish, the Yoruba, the Igbo, the African, over 1,000+ years, not the fairy tale stories about the transatlantic slave trade. Not that it didn't happen, but not in the way you described. People moved in from Europe into Africa, and that's been the path. But in GTR episode 25, we also looked at the founders of these universities. We still don't know who founded them. More recently with John Harvard, who he was, what he was, most likely then a black man with a black father, but they're stumped as to what he looked like. I was hoping that Cambridge would have a profile of him, because he received 2 degrees from Emmanuel College, Cambridge. We don't know. And the founders even of Oxford and Cambridge tried to look at the ancestral pathways, found French persons who were bearing the same surname, tried to look at the databases, could not really find much there. So we are left, literally holding the bag. We just don't know some of these things. But my journey has taken me to places like North Africa and the Middle East, globally, 130 countries and 7 continents, including Antarctica. And I tend to travel with my DNA kit. And here it is, the gripping picture of, again, as part of the studies and the research in Northern Africa. We have, in the year 1879, a Moorish man plowing the land, the Moroccan plow, driven by a donkey and a goat, in Tangier, Morocco, north of Africa. We have this approximately sort of 1875, 1879, the late 1800s. And that, to me, is just a gripping tale, because I've been to North Africa and took my kits, my cameras, saw more than 5,000 images with the faces removed, mostly in the Roman graveyards, the rest of the outlines preserved, a lot of the hands and other features of the body, but the faces. And even on the Cambridge site, on the blogs, I have copied the photographs of some of those images, like in this guy's, the Prince Jersey's castle with the face removed here in Poland, of Wales, where you can see the black Romans, how they looked like with their thick lips and large noses. We see images where, faces are removed in countless cases, not just in one place, but many places. So this is the some of the information we've been gathering, and of course I mentioned the Orphan files. DNA-wise, what were the Orphan files? If everyone recalls, those are instances where I'm matching with someone at a fairly strong degree, at the 4th, 5th cousin level, and neither parent is a match. Neither parent. So mom and dad not matching, and not just on another site, cross sites, but on the same sites, on the very same site, regardless of lab techniques and procedures and protocols and algorithms, the very same site. And I've given names and surnames and locations of some of these persons. About 300 files. Because it's not, for me, I could download them all, but again, 300 of them I was able to secure and PDF them and have them on my machine as part of then my research into the proving that they are rejecting the hypothesis about the haplogroup, the default haplogroup of Europe prior to the 1800s, or GTR says 800s, be it haplogroup E or R. And that's what I'm really trying to establish. So I wanted to talk about racism. We have an international convention now on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination as of the 14th of May, 2026. Well, as I say, better late than never. And we have one which covers multiple countries. But we know the worst cases. When you look at this list, again, we don't have to go in each and every country. There has been discrimination against Jews, but the question is, which Jews are you talking about? Because I'm Jewish, Hebrew, Shemitic, and Semitic. I'm haplogroup E. I've matched. There's the same grouping as Albert Einstein. Now he was a declared Jewish man. E is the oldest of all haplogroups. So I'm an E. I'm proud E. And are you talking about a Hebrew, a real Hebrew displaced? Because some of these countries have had notorious records, even speaking about Morocco, how the Moroccan Druze were driven out. And we can go and take a dive into even Morocco. We have a general description write-up concerning Black non-Arab migrants, more vulnerable, extortion, forced labor. We've had, this is a record that just encompasses Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, Mauritania, Morocco, and some other sort of countries. And there has been, I know, inward fighting towards Blacks and Arabs or Muslims. And we know that that has been documented throughout. And the timeline, though, it's in question, because are we talking about from the 600s, from Prophet Muhammad? It really calls into question the GTR timeline. If the 600s were really the 1600s, then how old? We know that, you know, from the Hebrew roots in Africa, from what Joshua Mapunga and others have said, that there are clearly deep roots of Judaism even in Africa. Islam is practiced today. We have white Christianity, and then, you know, of course, the figurehead being a white Jesus. And that's throughout Africa, so I could refer to as white Christianity. We have Ethiopia, which is one place where you have Judaism, and then they refer to it as an outlier in Judaism. But you have Jewish culture and practices in pretty much all African countries. So deeper roots than Islam, which is noticeable in the last 100, 200 years, which ties into the whole Great Reset movement. Again, Prophet Muhammad would have been 600s, but are we talking 600s or 1600s? Because of the collapsing timeline. But there's been, and the discrimination has been against, you said, Jews, and Jews being tossed out of different countries, especially in North Africa. And there's a section here that talks about the prejudice and hatred of Jews, but are we talking about haplogroup, you know, E's? Are we talking about Black Jews? Are we talking about the Berbers? Who exactly are we talking about? And this is the confusing point, because it's not being made clear. I've seen many cases. When you look at this list, this is the universal list of racism by country. And you could see there are several countries. I mean, Egypt, the question is, you have racism in Egypt? Well, Jada Pinkett Smith, she made a movie, Cleopatra, using a Black woman cast as the role in the role of Cleopatra, and they had 70,000 signatures to ban that movie because they are claiming ownership over everything to do with Cleopatra. But she was clearly a black woman, a black queen, as was the planet 200 years ago. So if you speak to Egyptians today, they're considered they're Arab. I don't think they even consider themselves African. A lot of places along the northern part of Africa, but I got a really good experience visiting Tunisia, Algeria, and they refer to myself as an ancestor, as a black or Berber blue man. And there's a lot of internal fighting. We know the Indians and Pakistanis, we know that they fight, amongst each other. You have China versus Taiwan. We have a lot of countries where similar ethnicities that are fighting. Even within Africa, they have these tribal, wars. But if you look at the whole list, we have a few countries, 4 that comes to mind that stand out when it comes to racism by country and policies and actions taken against blacks. We have the Grand USA. We have lynchings and shootings and burning down of villages and communities, and Tulsa, Oklahoma. You have so many of these instances where communities are destroyed. And of course, it just persists even to this day today. Groups like the KKK, I mean, you don't have this going on in the average country, but the kind of attacks, the level of attacks, the level of discrimination that blacks experience in the USA, that takes it to the very top of the list. The next would come on this list would then be South Africa with their questionable history. The whites come as, call it the Boers, the Dutch. That's yet to be seen because you have Freemasons like Guy Anderson, and they're talking about cabbage babies and small cages and moving them to South Africa as to the origins of whites. In the last 150, 200 years, there is no history beyond that for the white population, yet they control, you have less than 10% owning still today 80% of the country. How did they acquire? I even asked myself questions of my own family. My dad, his mom was a Potts. That family is now traced back to Panama. And then from Panama, the journey is going to the USA and Ellis Island. I have yet to then hammer out the final roots, but of that family, when they arrived in Jamaica, the Potts, they were given a mountain. Porter's Mountain. They were given literally a mountain for themselves. So who in government pulled those kind of strings? And in America, you have the Morgans of JP Morgan. We have the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the titans that we sit down and read, the Fords, like Henry Ford. We have these huge mega names that amassed great fortunes, the Kennedys. Who are organized, and they said that they're American Indians. My mom is an Indian, but the original Americans were copper-colored black people. Those that are on reservations, and again, it would say to sort of mitigate against the guilt because the Indians were killed out, but the black Americans are generally considered those Indians, reclassified as Indians of the Americas, the real owners of the land. And when that truth comes out, God help certain people, but that's the truth of the origins of those people. So with all the giving, someone gave them assets, gave them land, gave them a dominion, gave them authority. And so the white South Africans, they got from the land. The blacks were deprived in Jamaica. In the case of my own dad's mother's family, the Potts, they were just given land. And where they come from, again, some orphanage, some call it Cabbage Patch. The Potts came to Ellis Island. 80 to 90% of all whites in America can trace their roots to Ellis Island, given names, not knowing where they came from, no persecution, no wars, no one running them down, but they arrived. They came in massive, massive waves through Ellis Island, through New York, and then coming in the US and settling, and then having a system of oppression, which we have in America, we have in the case of South Africa, those two countries. In the case of Australia, where there are rumors that the game of polo was played in a very barbaric way, put the natives in the ground and lop off their heads with sticks, which, I mean, it's hard to even process. But, you know, those natives, and I met some of them, they're Aboriginal people, and the whole question of native title. One of the first cases I even did in UK law school in Mabo, and on the determination of native title. And it went through the courts, and there's no finality there. Natives still don't own the land. They're put up on reservations, and yet they bear the DNA signature, their S's. And they create a big question when it comes to analyzing this whole history. How did the haplogroup R attain such dominance and dominion over everyone else, as the standard, the modern day standard of male genealogy is supposed to be centered around R's. We can understand how R's can come from an O, which is an Indian Asian, because a lot of the diagrams you see in ancient literature and the history is Meso-Indians. But then what about the S? People forget that. The Aboriginal Black men are type S. So an S, a black man, would come from a white haplogroup R. That's impossible. You do not have, I mean, even the basic dumbest scientist can tell you that there's no way for a black dominant gene man to come from someone who's white. But they're saying that based on their analysis, based on the whole genealogy, based on the spectrum of their phylogenetic trees, it makes no sense. But back to the countries. So we have racism by country, USA on the top of the list. We have South Africa. We have Australia with their sick game of polo as it was played on the natives. We have Argentina. Certainly, we have a lot of, they're the whitest South American country. And they had policies like Cuba that would incentivize those who had white color to migrate, to come there, to travel, to come to those countries, and then they're given special treatment and rights. I mean, they've got the name in Spanish, but there are actually laws in place in a lot of Latin American countries that would incentivize whites to travel, and certainly they'd be benefited once they arrive. I mean, we've seen the case of white families benefiting in Europe, in USA, benefiting in the Caribbean, and just acquiring status, acquiring lands. And people would make decisions like marry based on the color of the skin and elevated status. That has been throughout the last 100 years easily. So this is a list, and I don't have to open up any on all of them. Let's look at Soviet Union, because a lot of the cabbage baby cards, they first came out of Russia. So we know that they're condemning the practice, but what about the history? They call them the Tartars. Well, who are the Tartars? See, they're quick to assign labels, and the Cossacks, of course. And who are they? Non-Aryan features and all the Poles, the Polish people, the Poles, trans Caucasians. Now that's a first. The Nak people. Now this is interesting. Two ethnic groups were specifically targeted for persecution in the Stalin era: the Chechens and the Ingush. And they targeted these groups. Banditism and being deported. But here, a lot of the in-country fighting and these acts of racism and terrorism, 1930s, so fairly recent. Okay, this is a section about the Jews. And the October Revolution, inspired by the Bolsheviks, seized power in a coup. And they took out, of course, the ruling clans. You have Tsar Nicholas and his family. They were killed. Just graphic stories in the early 1900s. They are strongly opposed to Judaism. We considered extensive campaign to suppress religious traditions of the Jewish population, along with traditional Jewish cultures. And it was an effort to promote Marxism, secularism, and Jewish assimilation into Soviet society. What would constitute, again, Jewish people? There are reports throughout the world, North Africa too, on the scouring and scattering of Jews and Hebrew people. And we all know about the Second World War, and we see some reports and photographs and what was taken. Although the numbers are not etched in stone, those numbers are still not confirmed, really. And so, needless to say, we had a lot of discrimination against Jewish people and of Hebrews. But what is not clear from the records is just what sort of, who you're talking about. Are we talking about people who would be classified as Berbers than those who are more Eastern European? That's not clear from the record. And they're quick to just gloss over and run to the World War II. There's a segment about Africans. 1963, number of students from Ghana. These are just small and minor cases with certain students. And it doesn't really answer a question about if we're talking about a Jew, we're talking about a Hebrew. Is it a person of color, more of a Berber that's described, or even someone who would be a Tartar or Cossack? Would it be, and those are people with just definite darker skin and black hair. And that would be the case for a lot of them. Again, the question here would be, what would be the color and the profile of the scattered Jews, those who were persecuted? And we know from the postcards generated, the cabbage babies, a lot of it came from Russia and filtered into France, and then some in the UK, and then Germany, throughout Europe, and then USA, Canada, and they were just circulated in most of the European countries. So this description, the descriptions of Jews, it's one thing to read when we're talking about the racial discrimination against persons of color. When we attach the Jewish label, who are we really talking about? Because that's not clear. And we can just read off these lists, and we see that a lot of them mention and reference Jews, but we're not talking about the Eastern European Jews. We're talking about the native, original, local Jewish people. And we have other instances where we have countries like Namibia, and we have countless deaths, 24,000 to 100,000. We, of course, have, and they said that similar to the European Jews, experimentation. But again, the actual genetic or ethnic profile of these people who were discriminated against, they're quick to just marry the terms And that's yet to be seen. That requires a deeper dive. And Republic of the Congo. Now, this takes the cake. We have here the Pygmies. They make up 2% of the population, and they live as slaves to Bantu masters. We're speaking about racial discrimination and what happened in the Congo with Leopold and the thousands upon thousands which were killed, possibly even be millions. We don't even, because these numbers are oftentimes filtered and underreported. But we could see Belgium and their acts taken in the Congo. I would expect in this article to see that reference. In Rwanda, right beneath, yes, we know of the genocide and what took place just in our lifetime in the 1990s. And it was the warring factions internally, even though those machetes allegedly came from China and were brought in, months before the genocide. Here it is, we have this tragic situation. But in the Congo, I would have expected them to reference Belgium and the slaughter that was committed by the Flemish, by Leopold, King Leopold in the Congo. But by and large, we have these skirmishes. We have small tribal internal fighting. But the big countries, I don't expect Switzerland to even be on this race sort of chart. And they're talking about domestic international relations in 2000s. And this being a strange place that's almost divided between three countries. And those who don't know, France, Italy, and Germany. If you look at the language and how this place is split up, Switzerland, that's really the country right there. But there's nothing to write home about. Nothing like the egregious cases and the extreme cases of USA, of South Africa, of Australia, and of course we have you could add Argentina, and that of its laws, not so much in the brutality that was exacted, but the laws that enticed and encouraged other whites to migrate for better opportunities, and the lightening of that population, which makes them the whitest South American country in the world. So we've discussed and we've covered a lot. Reflecting on this image, and the only image that I found in Rabat in Morocco, of a man who appears to be, we can't see from the profile of what he was. They have the picture shot at an angle, and from his hair, which is low cut, we don't know. We can't tell what's his ethnicity, but it's the only figure that we can see from the historical record back in Rabat in Morocco. But I close out by showing once again this image of this farmer in Morocco, a Moorish man plowing the land with a Moroccan plow driven by a donkey and a goat. Tangier, Morocco, north of Africa. And it's Morocco by Mundo de Amicus, 1875, Le Tour du Monde, 1879. And this is striking. This truly is a feat. And you can see nearby a kind of mosque, some sort of mosque in the left of the screen. Even though Islam has taken over Africa, there's still, again, deep-seated Jewish roots. And it's for us to explore those roots and discover further who we are, what we are. Don't be quick to just take on labels. because God knows we have had so many of them. But this is truly something you can stare at all day, just to try to wrap your head around the place, frozen in time. This is North Africa. So how did North Africa get so, I call it white, so fair, so fair? Because ultimately, when we look at GTR, when we look at the image of Christ and GTR episode 16, made black in the image of God, God was, they said, not blue-eyed and blonde and white-skinned, but he looked like someone from the Middle East, from North Africa. Well, this is a North African man, and he's not representative of the current population. But having been to North Africa, they admit they still can't eat the wheat. They need modified crops. They can't take the sun. They need cooling fans to blow water into the crowds during the summer. They have erased the faces of thousands of images in stone, and they look to me and say, hey, Dr. McDonald, you remind us of our ancestors just 150 years ago, like this man, like this farmer with his goat and donkey, but telling a story of a lost history, of a period lost in time when the default color was black, like the earth. And today we forget. Most of us, we don't know. So thank you. I leave it at that. Thank you for tuning in to GTR. We appreciate your support and appreciate you spreading that word of what we're trying to do. And we're trying to help people unpack and cover their ancestry. I spent quite a bit of time this past week with Ebanks, and he traced his roots, help of another Caymanian friend, Mario Ebanks, and he was able to determine that his haplogroup was R. And so I would invite him to the show to talk more about it on another episode. So for that, I'll leave it as that. Thank you. Good day, good evening, and have a good night to all.